Tired of the cheerful lies peddled by history textbooks, the ones that conveniently gloss over the more unseemly aspects of humanity? Are you utterly exhausted by the relentless cheerfulness of modern life, yearning for a deep, existential sigh? Excellent! You've come to precisely the right place, because tonight we're not just exploring history, we're weaponizing it for your weary soul. Welcome, my dear insomniacs, to a history lesson so delightfully, exhaustively grim, so profoundly drenched in human folly and desperation, it might just lull you into the deepest, most utterly miserable slumber of your wretched little life. Consider this your historical Ambien, without the unpleasant side effects of waking up in a different city or debating philosophy with a badger. We're about to peel back the polite, perfumed veneer of Western civilization and dive headfirst into the enduring, often squalid, and perpetually fascinating world of the brothel. Forget the romanticized portrayals of plucky madams with hearts of gold and courtesans with witty repartee. We're taking the unromanticized tour, from the crumbling, disease-ridden alleyways of antiquity to the gilded, yet still profoundly sad, cages of more recent centuries. This isn't a titillating exposé. It's a cold, hard historical autopsy, performed with a wry smirk and a healthy dose of existential dread. We're going to get our hands dirty, metaphorically speaking, because real history, the kind that actually happened, rarely smells of roses. Our tone throughout this extensive, perhaps excessively detailed, journey will be unapologetically sarcastic, brutally dark, and honest to a fault. No euphemisms will be tolerated, no delicate phrases employed to soften the blow of historical dirt and human folly. We are here for the unvarnished truth, the kind that might make you shift uncomfortably in your plush, modern chair, realizing that perhaps the human condition hasn't evolved quite as much as we like to pretend. This isn't a bedtime story. It's a historical exposé designed to highlight the repetitive, often depressing patterns of our species until your brain simply gives up and opts for unconsciousness. So, settle in. Get truly, deeply comfortable. Perhaps make yourself a lukewarm cup of chamomile tea because you're in for the long haul. This is a 180-minute, no-holds-barred, deep dive into the enduring human need for, well, let's call it commercial intimacy. It's a need that has manifested in countless ways, across millennia, always with the same underlying currents of desire, desperation, and profit. And I promise you, by the time we're done dragging you through every grimy corner and velvet-lined parlor, you'll either be sound asleep or questioning every single one of your life choices that led you to spend 3 hours listening to this. Either way, you're welcome. Chapter 2. Defining the Devil's Den. What exactly is a brothel? Before we plunge into the murky waters of historical context, let's establish some ground rules. What exactly are we talking about when we say brothel? Is it just a building with a red light, a clandestine whisper in a dark alley, or something far more intricate? The answer, as with most things in history, is delightfully complex and frustratingly elusive. It's more than just a place. It's a concept, a legal loophole, a social lightning rod, and often a tragic microcosm of society itself. Across centuries and cultures, the definition has twisted and contorted like a particularly desperate contortionist trying to avoid a moral judgment. Beyond the iconic, almost cliché red light, which we will, of course, explore in due time, the definition of a brothel has always been a shifting target, subject to the whims of local laws, societal anxieties, and architectural necessity. Legally, it's often a place where prostitution is sanctioned, tolerated, or at least strategically ignored by authorities, offering a space for transactions of a very specific nature. Socially, it's a place of convergence, a nexus where different classes, different desires, and often different realities collide, if only for a fleeting, transactional moment. Architecturally, it's a building specifically designed, adapted, or just plain used for these services, from crude shacks to opulent mansions. But a brothel was, and often still is, so much more than a simple venue for a commercial transaction. Think of it as a perverse kind of social institution. For some, it was a place of refuge, however temporary or ill-fated, offering a semblance of stability or protection from the even harsher realities of the streets. For many, it was an economic engine, churning out profits for madams, landlords, and occasionally the women themselves, keeping a surprising number of local economies afloat in some dark, symbiotic dance. And for others, particularly the women trapped within their walls, they were often prisons, gilded or otherwise, where debt, coercion, and societal scorn forged invisible but unbreakable chains. They weren't just businesses, they were often entire ecosystems of human need and exploitation. Societies, in their infinite hypocrisy, have always grappled with how to rationalize the existence of these establishments. The default setting was almost always tolerated evil. It was the convenient argument that if men were going to be men, then it was best to corral their urges into specific, regulated, or at least semi-regulated zones, keeping respectable women safe and the public order largely undisturbed. This was often justified as a lesser evil, preventing rape or other societal breakdown, a grim calculation that effectively sacrificed a certain class of women for the perceived good of the broader population. The underlying sentiment? It's awful, of course, but imagine how much worse it would be without them. A sentiment as old as civilization itself, and just as morally bankrupt. And, of course, the language surrounding this trade has evolved into a glorious glossary of despair and euphemism. From the blunt practicality of stews in medieval London, literally bathhouses that, for some reason, also offered other services, to the more elegant bordellos of Italy and the ancient lupanars of Rome, named after the she-wolf, a symbol of both nurturing and ferality. Then there are the more genteel, almost poetic phrases: houses of ill repute, houses of assignation, pleasure houses, each one attempting to wrap the raw transaction in a veil of linguistic delicacy, a desperate attempt to make the unspeakable sound just a little more palatable. It's a linguistic tightrope walk, attempting to acknowledge a pervasive reality while simultaneously pretending it's not that bad. Chapter 3. Cradle of Vice, Ancient Mesopotamia and Egypt. Our journey into the historical abyss begins in the very cradles of civilization, where the lines between sacred and secular, between spiritual devotion and commercial transaction, were often so blurry you'd need a particularly strong prescription to tell them apart. Imagine, if you will, the sweltering heat of ancient Mesopotamia, the ziggurats reaching for the heavens, and amidst it all, the nascent forms of what would one day become the full-fledged brothel. Early prostitution wasn't just a transaction. It was often intertwined with religious practices, from temple virgins dedicating their bodies to a goddess to streetwalkers plying their trade under the watchful eyes of ancient empires. It was less red light district and more sacred grove with surprisingly robust market activity. Take, for instance, the Code of Hammurabi, that grand legal achievement of Babylonian justice, etched in stone for all to mostly ignore. While it didn't explicitly detail brothels as we know them, it certainly laid down some early, often brutal, attempts at regulation concerning women, property rights, and various social arrangements that hint at the complex stratification of sex work. It wasn't about moral condemnation so much as maintaining social order and property ownership. Women involved in certain forms of sacred prostitution, like the kadishtu or naditu, held specific social statuses, often with property rights and a degree of independence that street-level workers certainly lacked. It was a bizarre blend of religious duty, economic necessity, and societal categorization, all wrapped up in the dust and heat of the Fertile Crescent. Moving across the sands to ancient Egypt, the evidence for dedicated pleasure houses is, shall we say, fragmented, much like a papyrus scroll that's seen one too many sandstorms. We piece together hints from papyri, ostraca, those delightful ceramic shards used for writing notes, and even tomb paintings, which sometimes depict scenes of feasting, music, and companionship. While not overtly described as brothels, these fragments certainly hint at dedicated spaces for entertainment, wine, and intimacy. Think less Pompeii lupanar and more private party at a nobleman's estate with exceedingly friendly waitstaff. The wealthy could afford discretion, the poor less so. A tale as old as time, or at least as old as hieroglyphs. This era, more than any other, is fertile ground for archaeological speculation rather than concrete historical fact. We're dealing with inferences, educated guesses, and the occasional raised eyebrow from a modern historian looking at an ancient carving. But what does begin to emerge, like a faint mirage in the desert, is the transactional nature of these interactions. Whether sacred or purely secular, whether in a temple courtyard or a back alley, the exchange of services for goods, money, or status was undeniably present. It marks the dawn of commercial exchange for intimacy, a practice that, despite millennia of societal hand-wringing and moralizing, has proven remarkably durable. The foundational brick of the entire, depressing edifice was being laid, one dusty, ancient transaction at a time. Chapter 4. Grecian Getaways, Hetairai, Pornai, and Philosophical Patrons. Ah, ancient Greece, the birthplace of democracy, philosophy, drama, and a surprisingly sophisticated, two-tiered system for commercial intimacy. Here, you didn't just have one kind of sex worker, you had a distinctly stratified social structure, reflecting the Greeks' fondness for categorizing absolutely everything. At the top of this peculiar pyramid were the hetaira, the companions. These weren't your common streetwalkers. Oh no, these were the creme de la creme, the intellectual heavyweights, the women who could hold a conversation about Plato as easily as they could charm a powerful general. They were educated, influential, expensive, and often, ironically, the only women allowed to participate in intellectual discourse with men outside of the cloistered domestic sphere. Imagine paying for intimacy and getting a philosophy lecture thrown in for free. What a deal! Below the glittering world of the hetairai were the porne. This is where the word pornography ultimately comes from, which should tell you a thing or two about their status. These were the common kind, the street-level workers, often slaves or foreign women, nameless and largely voiceless in the grand historical narrative of the Hellenic world. They operated in the shadows, in designated districts, or out of simple rooms, providing the most basic and least celebrated form of sexual service. Their lives were undoubtedly harsh, precarious, and short, a stark contrast to the intellectual saloons frequented by their high-class counterparts. They were the forgotten masses, the anonymous cogs in a system that required their silent suffering to maintain the illusion of order and propriety elsewhere. Commercial intimacy was deeply integrated into the fabric of Greek social gatherings, particularly the symposium. Picture this: a gathering of elite men, reclining on couches, drinking wine, debating philosophy, reciting poetry, and always with hetairai present. These women weren't just decorative. They were active participants, entertainers, musicians, and often the intellectual equals or superiors of the men they were hired to entertain. They added a layer of sophistication, wit, and, yes, sexual availability to these gatherings, making the symposium a full-service experience. It was a societal pressure release valve, allowing men to indulge in various pleasures and intellectual pursuits away from their respectable, secluded wives. Even the revered philosophers of the era, Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, pondered, debated, and often embodied the fascinating hypocrisy of their era concerning desire and societal order. Plato, in his Symposium, famously has a hetaira named Diadema teach Socrates about the true nature of love. Yet, for all their intellectualizing, they rarely questioned the underlying exploitation or the deeply unequal societal structures that necessitated the existence of porne. They theorized about ideal states and abstract concepts of beauty and virtue, all while benefiting from a system that relied on the very human desires and societal stratifications they sometimes decried. It's a classic case of do as I say, not as I do, or more accurately, let's discuss elevated concepts while ignoring the messy reality beneath our feet. Chapter 5: Roman Real Estate, Lupanaria, and the Business of Lust. If the Greeks were philosophers of lust, the Romans were its pragmatic engineers. The Roman Empire took a remarkably efficient, almost bureaucratic, approach to the business of bodies. Prostitution wasn't just tolerated, it was legal, taxed, and integrated into the very urban fabric, a testament to Rome's genius for administration and its equally impressive capacity for indulgence. You could find a brothel, or at least a sex worker, almost anywhere in the sprawling empire, from the bustling port cities to the quietest provincial towns. It was simply another regulated industry, another cog in the vast, well-oiled machine of Roman society, generating revenue and, in their eyes, maintaining order. And when it comes to the architecture of desire, Pompeii, preserved in its volcanic ash time capsule, offers the most perfectly horrifying examples, the lupanaria. These were not grand, opulent palaces, for the most part. Imagine small, cramped cells, often no more than a stone bed. Yes, a solid, unyielding stone bed, covered with a thin mattress, if you were lucky. The walls, however, often told a different story, adorned with explicit frescoes depicting various sexual acts, serving both as advertisements for services and perhaps as a silent menu for illiterate clients. It was stark, functional, and built purely for purpose, a grim testament to the efficiency of the Roman pleasure industry. The air, I imagine, would have been a heady mix of stale sweat, cheap wine, and the ever-present scent of desperation. Roman society, in its boundless capacity for social stratification, ensured that there were brothels for all classes, from the lowliest slave to the most powerful senator. You could find prostitutes working in cramped alleyways, in the bustling public baths, which, let's be honest, were often glorified hookup spots anyway, in the taverns, or in the lavish, discreet establishments catering to the imperial elite. No stratum of Roman society was left without its opportunity for commercial intimacy. The grand Roman villa might have its discreet chamber, while the docks of Ostia would have their rough and tumble shacks. It was a truly democratic vice, available to anyone with a few coins and a willingness to brave the smell. And then there's the graffiti. Oh, the glorious, vulgar graffiti of Pompeii. Etched into the stone walls, preserved for nearly 2 millennia, are the original Yelp reviews of depravity. Names, prices, explicit descriptions of services offered, even boasts from satisfied or dissatisfied customers. Secundus was a good boy. Atticus, the boy, is a pervert. Here, I buggered many girls. It's an uncensored, utterly human glimpse into the daily transactions of the Roman brothel, unfiltered by historians or moralizers. It tells us that human desires, even 2,000 years ago, were remarkably similar, and that people have always loved leaving their mark, especially when it involves sex and boasting. Imagine a modern city where every public restroom stall boasted ancient Roman-style reviews. A truly horrifying thought, isn't it? Chapter 6. The Fall and the Faith. Early Christian Condemnations. As the Roman Empire slowly but surely began its long, drawn-out decline, a new spiritual superpower was on the rise: Christianity. And with it came a dramatically new, rigid moral framework that explicitly condemned fornication, sexual indulgence outside of procreative marriage, and pretty much any pleasure of the flesh that wasn't sanctioned by a particularly dour church elder. This was a stark departure from the Roman pragmatism that had seen brothels as a tax source and a societal convenience. For the early Christians, sex was either for babies or for eternal damnation, with very little wiggle room in between. The party was officially, and quite emphatically, over. Initial attempts by Christian emperors to dismantle long-standing Roman institutions of vice were, to put it mildly, enthusiastic. Edicts were issued, lupanaria were targeted, and the zealous faithful often took matters into their own hands, attempting to purify the urban landscape of what they saw as the ultimate sin. Imagine hordes of fervent monks descending upon a bustling Roman pleasure quarter, armed with crucifixes and righteous indignation, attempting to shut down businesses that had been operating for centuries. It was less a gentle moral persuasion and more a full frontal assault on a deeply entrenched part of daily life. And, as you might expect, it was about as effective as trying to herd cats with a wet noodle. Because, of course, the Church, in its infinite wisdom and constant struggle with human weakness, eventually had to confront a rather inconvenient truth. People still desired sex, a lot of it. And when you close all the established, relatively controlled venues, You don't magically make the desire disappear. You just drive it underground, making it more dangerous, more exploitative, and far harder to monitor. This led to a fascinating, paradoxical tolerance, a grudging acceptance of prostitution as a necessary evil, a concept that would echo through millennia, intended to prevent what they deemed worse sins, like rape, adultery with respectable women, or general societal chaos. The argument went, better for men to find release with fallen women than to defile virgins or honest wives. A truly compassionate viewpoint, wouldn't you agree? This marked a slow, painful, and often very messy shift in perception. What was once a public institution, legal and taxed, slowly morphed into a private sin, driven into the shadows. The Roman streetwalker might have been disdained, but she was largely acknowledged. The Christian prostitute was simultaneously condemned, pitied, and often actively persecuted. The trade didn't vanish. It simply adapted, becoming more clandestine, more dangerous, and forcing those within it to operate under a constant veil of shame and fear. It was the beginning of a long, dark era where the existence of brothels was acknowledged as an inconvenient truth, but never openly sanctioned, creating a fertile ground for hypocrisy and exploitation that would last for centuries. Chapter 7: Medieval Morality Mazes: Sin, Sickness, and Society's Needs. Welcome to the High Middle Ages, where morality was a maze of conflicting doctrines, and societies stumbled forward in a perpetually confused state between divine piety and very earthly desires. The Church, bless its contradictory heart, maintained its tightrope walk, perpetually balancing between condemning prostitution as a gateway to hell and begrudgingly accepting it as a necessary evil. One minute, a fiery sermon would damn all those involved to eternal damnation. The next, a city council, often influenced by the church, would grudgingly tolerate, even regulate, the local stews to prevent what they considered greater sins. It was a theological migraine, a constant push-pull between the spiritual ideal and the undeniable, smelly reality of human nature. Yet, despite the moralizing, civic regulation was surprisingly common. Cities like London, particularly in its infamous Sawwork district with its stews, and bustling Paris, actively attempted to control, tax, and even quarantine the trade. These weren't enlightened liberal policies, they were practical measures. Authorities wanted to know where these women were, to collect revenue, of course, and rather cynically, to confine them to specific areas, out of sight and out of mind, to maintain a semblance of respectability in the main urban centers. Imagine a medieval city planner, sighing dramatically, reluctantly drawing a little circle on the map labeled, "Here be vice, keep it away from the cathedral." And here's where medieval ingenuity truly shines in its dark irony. Brothels as public health measures. Yes, you read that right. The cynical argument, often deployed when outright abolition failed, was that by confining sex workers to specific, designated areas, you could contain disease. It was a precursor to quarantine, applied specifically to women already marginalized, under the guise of protecting the wider population from venereal diseases that were increasingly understood, though poorly treated. This, naturally, meant that the stews often became literal breeding grounds for illness, further endangering the very women they purported to contain. A truly visionary public health strategy if your vision is particularly warped. Even royalty and nobility, those paragons of virtue, in public anyway, were not immune to the siren call of the brothel, often having their own establishments or tolerating them in close proximity to their castles and courts. Kings might issue grand decrees condemning vice, then conveniently ignore the thriving brothel just down the road from their palace. This disconnect between law and practice, between public pronouncement and private indulgence, was a perennial feature of the medieval landscape. It showed that even at the highest echelons of power, the necessary evil argument held sway, revealing the deeply entrenched hypocrisy at the heart of medieval society. Morality, it seems, was a flexible concept when you wore a crown. Chapter 8. The Crusades' Curious Contribution. New Needs, New Diseases. Just when you thought the Middle Ages couldn't get any grimier, along came the Crusades, adding an extra layer of chaos and carnal complexity to an already confused era. Imagine vast armies of men ripped from their homes, marching across continents, fueled by religious zeal and a severe lack of anything resembling comfort or familiarity. The logistical nightmare of feeding, clothing, and simply managing these soldiers also included the rather inconvenient reality of their relief needs. Suddenly, temporary brothel zones sprang up like particularly noxious mushrooms wherever an army pitched its tents, a grim, unspoken necessity for maintaining morale, or at least preventing outright mutiny, fueled by pent-up frustration. But the Crusades brought more than just new landscapes and spiritual fervor. They brought new pathogens, or at least significantly ramped up the virulence of existing ones. This period is often cited as a potential vector for the suspected arrival of syphilis from the New World, or perhaps the virulent evolution of existing venereal diseases. Soldiers, mixing with diverse populations across vast distances, created a perfect storm for the rapid transmission of illnesses. What was once a localized inconvenience became a continent-spanning epidemic, silently marching alongside the armies, infecting bodies and fueling further moral panic. These were the original military brothels, unofficial but widespread, a grim precursor to the state-sanctioned sex work we'd see in later conflicts. Wherever soldiers gathered, whether waiting to embark or returning victorious or defeated, a makeshift economy of commercial intimacy quickly materialized. These were not glamorous places. Think muddy tents, crowded taverns, and desperate transactions, all under the shadow of war and imminent death. They provided a brief, brutal respite from the horrors of conflict, but often at a terrible cost to the women involved, who were frequently local inhabitants caught in the crossfire of male desire and wartime desperation. Indeed, the Crusades, like so many conflicts before and since, highlighted the unholy trinity that so often accompanies human strife: war, poverty, and sexually transmitted infections. These three grim companions marched hand in hand, leaving a trail of suffering in their wake. Poverty drove women into the trade. War created the desperate demand, and the unhygienic, unregulated conditions ensured that disease spread like wildfire, devastating lives and further stigmatizing those involved. It's a stark reminder that even in an age of supposed spiritual purity, the baser realities of human existence continued to assert themselves with relentless, brutal force. Chapter 9. Renaissance Rebirth: Courtesans, Culture, and Commerce. After the grim confusion of the Middle Ages, Europe decided it was time for a rebirth, a renaissance of art, philosophy, and, naturally, particularly elegant forms of commercial intimacy. Nowhere was this more evident than in the vibrant Italian city-states like Venice and Florence, bustling centers of culture, commerce, and, crucially, high-class courtesans. These weren't the crude streetwalkers of previous eras. These were women who often shaped the cultural landscape, influencing fashion, art, and even politics. Venice, in particular, became famous for its courtesans, who were as much of a part of its glittering allure as its canals and gondolas. The honest courtesan, a delightful paradox of a title, isn't it, emerged as a distinct, celebrated figure. These women were educated, witty, politically connected, and fluent in multiple languages. They could recite Petrarch, discuss Machiavelli, and charm a duke, often simultaneously. They were a different breed of woman, inhabiting a unique social space where their intellect and beauty commanded respect, if not full societal acceptance. They were celebrated in art, literature, and society pages, often wielding significant power and influence, a stark contrast to the veiled, silent wives of the elite. They were, in essence, the original influencers, but with significantly more danger and considerably less product placement. This era saw a fascinating blurring of lines between art and patronage, particularly involving these women. Courtesans became muses, their portraits commissioned by powerful patrons, celebrated for their beauty, intelligence, and wit. Think Titian's Venus of Urbino, debated by scholars for centuries, but widely believed to be a Venetian courtesan. They were not just subjects, they were collaborators, their images immortalized in galleries, reflecting an era where the lines between respectable society and the demimonde were often deliciously indistinct. Their presence in art reflected a society grappling with its own desires, projecting them onto canvases where they could be admired, envied, and safely contained. But for all their elegance and influence, the economics of elegance remained a precarious balance. High prices, lavish lifestyles, opulent homes, and extensive wardrobes defined the successful courtesan. Yet, beneath the glittering surface lay an ever-present vulnerability. A change in patron, a loss of youth, a shift in political winds, or the ever-looming threat of disease could plunge them into poverty and societal condemnation faster than you could say Renaissance plague. Their wealth was immense, but their security was fragile, a constant reminder that even at the pinnacle of this particular profession, they were still ultimately dependent on the whims of powerful men and a society that judged them even as it desired them. Chapter 10. The Black Death's Brothel Boom, Chaos and Carnality. Just as the Renaissance was attempting to reintroduce some semblance of order and beauty, the Black Death swept across Europe, plunging the continent into unprecedented social upheaval and a profound questioning of everything. When a third to half of the population drops dead within a few years, societal norms tend to go out the window, replaced by a desperate, often hedonistic sense of eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. The plague created an existential crisis of epic proportions, and for many, the response was not quiet contemplation, but a frantic pursuit of immediate pleasure, leading to a rather grim, unexpected brothel boom. The plague's aftermath left behind a devastated landscape, not just of corpses, but of shattered families, economic collapse, and widespread poverty. With traditional livelihoods obliterated and countless women suddenly widowed, orphaned, or simply desperate for survival, more and more were driven into sex work. It wasn't a choice. It was often the only viable option to stave off starvation or homelessness. The plague, in its indiscriminate horror, created a massive new supply of vulnerable individuals, forced by sheer economic necessity into the oldest profession. The Grim Reaper's scythe proved to be an unexpected recruiting tool for the brothels. And where there is human misery, there are always those eager to profit from it. The Black Death created new opportunities for opportunistic madams and bawds who capitalized on societal collapse and existential dread. With so many vying for basic necessities, the leverage shifted dramatically, making exploitation easier and more pervasive. Brothels became a grim reflection of the new economic reality, fueled by desperation and turning a profit from the very human instinct to seek any comfort, however fleeting, in the face of widespread oblivion. It was the ultimate, darkly comedic market correction. This period saw a kind of hedonistic reaction to horror, a grim license for indulgence in the face of widespread oblivion. If God was going to wipe everyone out anyway, why not have one last fling? Moral strictures loosened, social restraints crumbled, and the pursuit of carnal pleasure became, for some, a defiant act against the looming specter of death. It was a societal Wild West, where the fleeting nature of life justified, in the minds of many, a frenzied pursuit of indulgence, however temporary or ill-advised. The brothel, in its own macabre way, became a testament to humanity's desperate, enduring will to live, or at least to feel something, anything, before the inevitable. Chapter 11. Reformation's Fury, Puritanical Backlash and Repression. Just as Europe was recovering from the plague and indulging in a spot of Renaissance extravagance, along came the Reformation, like a particularly severe headmaster with a ruler. Protestant zeal swept across parts of the continent, bringing with it a renewed, fervent drive for moral purity and an explicit, uncompromising condemnation of brothels and all forms of what they deemed unchaste behavior. If Catholicism had grudgingly tolerated a necessary evil, Protestantism declared it an outright abomination, a direct affront to God and good order. The party, which had briefly roared back to life after the plague, was now officially, religiously, and very aggressively shut down. This zeal translated into specific campaigns to close down the dreaded stews and other houses of ill repute, particularly in London and other Protestant cities. Imagine moral brigades, often backed by civic authorities, actively raiding, shutting down, and sometimes even physically dismantling these establishments. It was often violent, highly disruptive, and publicly shaming. The bawds and the women working within were often publicly punished, banished, or left destitute. The goal wasn't just to regulate, it was to eradicate, to wipe the stain of sin from the urban landscape, whether the demand for such services actually disappeared or not. Meanwhile, the Catholic Counter-Reformation, while equally concerned with moral rectitude, took a somewhat more nuanced, though still condemnatory, approach. While officially condemning prostitution, the pragmatic realities of human nature still often led to a policy of tolerating lesser evils to prevent greater ones. The idea remained: better to confine vice to designated areas than to have it spill out into respectable society, causing more profound moral decay or disrupting the sacred institution of marriage. It was a similar reasoning to earlier centuries, but now infused with a renewed, albeit tempered, sense of religious urgency. The overall effect, regardless of the specific denominational approach, was a significant shift from a publicly tolerated, if morally ambiguous, institution to a clandestine, hidden sin. Brothels, where they persisted, were driven underground, making them inherently more dangerous, more exploitative, and far harder to track or regulate. The women involved were pushed further to the margins of society, vulnerable to increased violence, disease, and the unchecked power of those who controlled the illicit trade. It was a classic example of prohibition failing to eliminate demand, and instead simply making the industry darker and more insidious. The invisible hand of morality, it turned out, often gripped a very heavy club. Chapter 12. Elizabethan England's Underbelly. Stews, Bawds, and Bardic References. Despite the waxing and waning puritanical leanings and the occasional royal decree condemning vice, brothels, being like weeds that thrive in cracks of moral pavements, stubbornly continued to flourish in Elizabethan London's seedy districts. Especially in areas like Southwark, just across the Thames, conveniently out of the jurisdiction of the City of London proper, the stews, those delightful bathhouses that offered more than just a scrub, continued to operate with a brazen, if often grim, vitality. It was an open secret, a wink and a nod from authorities who, for all their proclamations, understood the practical necessity of corralling human desires into designated zones. And who better to capture the everyday reality of this underbelly than William Shakespeare? His plays are absolutely brimming with references to brothels, bawds, and the general shenanigans of the era's sex trade. Think of Mistress Overdone in Measure for Measure, running a brothel with a pragmatic disdain for moralists, or the various colorful insults involving bawd and pimp scattered throughout his comedies and tragedies. These weren't exotic, far-flung references. They were commonplace, reflecting the everyday reality of Elizabethan London, where a trip to the theater might be followed by a visit to a nearby stew for a different kind of entertainment. The bard painted a vivid picture of a society where vice was an acknowledged, if often condemned, part of the urban tapestry. This era also saw the professionalization of the bawd and the pimp, those early figures of organized crime. These were the controllers, the managers, the gatekeepers of this particular market. They ran the houses, recruited the women, collected the profits, and often offered a perverse kind of protection, for a price, of course. They were the entrepreneurs of exploitation, navigating the delicate balance between civic toleration and outright illegality, constantly hedging their bets against raids and moral crackdowns. They controlled networks of sex workers, ensuring a steady supply for the equally steady demand, becoming powerful, often feared, figures in the shadows of the city. But let's not romanticize it. The rough reality of life in Elizabethan brothels was far from the witty banter of Shakespeare's plays. Disease, particularly the dreaded French pox, syphilis, was rampant. Violence was an ever-present threat from disgruntled clients, rival gangs, or overzealous authorities. Poverty was a constant companion, trapping women in a cycle of debt and despair. And lives were tragically short, cut short by illness, violence, or the sheer grinding hardship of their profession. It was a brutal existence, a far cry from the romanticized image of bohemian freedom. The stage lights may have shone brightly on Shakespeare's world, but the reality of the stews was perpetually shrouded in shadow and grime. Chapter 13. 17th Century Splendor and Squalor. Amsterdam's Tolerance, London's Labyrinth. As Europe lumbered into the 17th century, a fascinating juxtaposition of splendor and squalor emerged, particularly in the bustling urban centers. Take Amsterdam, for instance, a beacon of Dutch pragmatism. While not officially legalized, prostitution and other vices often enjoyed a famous, though often unofficial, tolerance. The Dutch, ever the astute merchants, understood that a certain degree of permissiveness helped fuel their economic engine and maintain a relatively peaceful, albeit diverse, populace. Imagine a city where vice was simply another commodity, quietly managed, carefully contained, and definitely generating revenue. It was a practical, rather than moral, approach, a quiet nod to the inconvenient truth of human nature. Across the Channel, French refinement was beginning to show early signs of what would become the grand Parisian maisons of later centuries. While not yet in their full opulent glory, the seeds of luxurious indulgence were being sown, particularly in the private salons and discreet apartments of the aristocracy. The French, with their innate sense of aesthetics, began to elevate the experience, blending pleasure with artifice, anticipating an era where a visit to a bordello might be as much about the ambiance and conversation as the ultimate transaction. It was the precursor to a more curated, refined form of vice, setting the stage for future splendor. Meanwhile, London, despite repeated closures and moralizing crusades, proved itself a master of adaptation. The trade didn't disappear, it simply went underground, becoming more discreet, more insidious, and far harder to trace. Operating out of coffee houses, taverns, and private homes, prostitutes and bawds learned to navigate a labyrinthine world of secret knock, coded language, and shifting allegiances. It was a constant game of cat and mouse with authorities, a testament to the ingenuity and resilience of both those seeking and those providing illicit services. The city's underbelly pulsed with a hidden life, a secret society of pleasure and peril, invisible to polite society but utterly pervasive. This era also marked the dawn of public enlightenment, a period where philosophers, from the safety of their studies, began discussing societal ills, sometimes including the vice, with a detached academic curiosity. They weren't necessarily condemning it from a moral standpoint, rather they were analyzing it as a social phenomenon, a byproduct of human nature or urban development. It was less about salvation and more about sociological observation, a cool, intellectual gaze cast upon the messy realities of the human condition. Imagine a particularly learned gentleman sipping brandy by the fire, writing treatises on the moral economy of the brothel, a rather detached yet utterly fitting image for the age of reason. Chapter 14. 18th Century Enlightenment's Erotica, From Courtesans to Commoners. The 18th century, the Age of Reason, was a glorious contradiction, a magnificent societal schizophrenia. On one hand, you had towering intellects debating liberty, equality, and the pursuit of knowledge. On the other, you had rampant sexual indulgence, a societal embrace of pleasure that often bordered on the bacchanalian. It was an era where the pursuit of intellectual enlightenment walked hand in hand with an equally fervent pursuit of erotic delight, often in the very same salons where philosophers debated natural rights. The human brain, it seems, can hold a great deal of conflicting desires simultaneously. This era saw the flourishing of high society bordellos, not necessarily the sprawling public houses of later centuries, but discreet, often lavish establishments catering exclusively to the elite. These were places that required introductions, impeccable decorum, at least initially, and a hefty purse. They were less about crude transactions and more about curated experiences, elegant dinners, stimulating conversation, and the promise of ultimate discretion. Think opulent townhouses with secret passages and hidden chambers, where dukes could forget their political woes and gentlemen could indulge their most private fantasies, far from the prying eyes of their wives and the judgmental gaze of society. And what fueled these desires, beyond simple human biology? The rise of printed erotica. Pamphlets, engravings, and secret histories that tantalized and titillated, often disguised as scandalous memoirs or moralistic tales. These publications, ranging from crude woodcuts to exquisitely detailed etchings, spread desires and fantasies across class lines, making once private indulgences accessible to a wider audience, at least in pictorial form. It was the original adult content, mass-produced and eagerly consumed, proving that the human mind, given the right stimulus, is an incredibly fertile ground for imagination and titillation. Yet, despite this widespread indulgence, the societal tug-of-war between public virtue and private vice continued unabated. There were moral panics, particularly when scandals broke or disease outbreaks occurred, but these were often quickly followed by a quiet, almost resigned acceptance. Society understood, on some unspoken level, that closing down the venues didn't eliminate the desires, merely relocated them. It was a perpetual cycle of feigned outrage and quiet complicity, a societal dance where everyone knew the steps but pretended to be shocked by the music. The Enlightenment may have brought light to many aspects of human existence, but it cast particularly long, intriguing shadows over its erotic underworld. Chapter 15: Colonial Brothels, Expanding Empires, Expanding Enticements. As European powers aggressively expanded their empires across the globe, planting their flags wherever they could find new resources to exploit or new peoples to civilize, they also, with remarkable consistency, established brothels. Wherever the flag went, the needs of the flesh inevitably followed. Soldiers, sailors, settlers, traders, a largely male, often lonely, and frequently brutal population, required the specific services that only commercial intimacy could provide. Thus, brothels became an inevitable, if rarely celebrated, component of colonial expansion, springing up like persistent fungi in the damp, new soils of foreign lands. Garrison towns and colonial outposts, those remote and often desolate corners of empire, became predictable hotspots for organized prostitution. Far from home, surrounded by unfamiliar cultures, and often facing incredible hardship and boredom, soldiers and administrators formed a ready and eager clientele. These establishments served not just as places for sexual release, but often as makeshift social centers, offering a fleeting sense of normalcy, camaraderie, and escape from the harsh realities of colonial life. They were a necessary evil, a grim logistical component of maintaining order and morale in distant, often hostile lands. The racial dynamics within these colonial brothels were, predictably, horrifying. The exploitation of indigenous populations was rampant, with local women often coerced or forced into sex work, becoming yet another resource to be consumed by the colonizers. This created a complex, often tragic, mixing of cultures in these raw, new environments. European men seeking exotic experiences, and indigenous women forced into a desperate means of survival, creating a legacy of racialized sexual violence and exploitation that lingers to this day. It was a dark mirror reflecting the power imbalances inherent in colonialism itself. And it is in this context that we see the historical roots of what, in a later, more notorious context, would be termed comfort women. While the term typically refers to 20th century Asia and the Japanese Imperial Army, the concept, military-controlled or sanctioned sexual slavery for soldiers, is far, far older. European colonial powers, while perhaps less overtly systematized, certainly created environments where women were pressed into service for their troops, often with little choice or compensation. The names, the faces, the exact mechanisms might change, but the grim reality of armies demanding and obtaining sexual services from subjugated populations is a thread that runs depressingly consistently through military history. Chapter 16: The French Revolution's Aftermath, Liberty, and Lupanars. The French Revolution, that glorious, bloody whirlwind of ideals, initially swept through society with a zeal to clean up not just the aristocracy, but also its associated decadence. Royalist brothels, symbols of monarchical indulgence, were targeted. Aristocratic patrons were guillotined, and the revolutionary fervor, for a brief, heady moment, seemed intent on condemning all forms of unchaste behavior, viewing it as another corrupt excess of the Ancien Regime. Imagine the passionate rhetoric, the calls for virtue and republican morality, as revolutionaries, perhaps still smelling of gunpowder, vowed to purify Parisian society of its sinful establishments. For a moment, it seemed even the oldest profession might be overthrown. But then came the Thermidorian reaction. A swift, brutal swing back towards hedonism after the puritanical terror of the Jacobins. After years of fear, austerity, and watching heads roll, the populace craved pleasure, indulgence, and anything that wasn't a grim revolutionary tribunal. New forms of permissiveness sprang up. A desperate collective embrace of life and sensation after such widespread death. The brothels, which had briefly cowered in the shadows, re-emerged with a vengeance, catering to a society starved for sensation and eager to forget the recent past. It was a societal hangover, cured by a fresh wave of debauchery. The Napoleonic era that followed brought with it, as Napoleon was wont to do, attempts at bureaucratic regulation and control. This wasn't about moralizing, it was about public order and, crucially, military health. Napoleon, a practical man, understood that his soldiers, like all soldiers, had needs, and that unregulated vice led to disease and inefficiency. So, measures were put in place to register prostitutes, mandate health checks, often invasive and humiliating for the women, and control where and how brothels operated. It was the birth of a more modern, systematized approach to managing the sex trade, driven by pragmatism rather than piety. The enduring power of demand, it turns out, is a force even revolutions cannot extinguish. You can chop off heads, rewrite constitutions, and declare new eras of virtue, but you cannot legislate away basic human desire. The flame of commercialized sex, flickering precariously during the terror, roared back to life with renewed vigor. proving that, for all the grand ideals of liberty and equality, the demand for lupanars remained a constant. The revolution changed everything and nothing, leaving behind a legacy of grand ideas and the continued prosaic reality of brothels serving a society that simply refused to be entirely virtuous. Chapter 17: The Industrial Revolution's Irony, Urbanization and Unfortunates. As the 19th century dawned, a new kind of revolution, the Industrial Revolution, swept across the Western world, bringing with it a torrent of change. Masses of people migrated from the quiet, predictable countryside to the sprawling, chaotic new cities, seeking work in the burgeoning factories. The result? Overcrowding, profound poverty, rapid industrialization, and unprecedented social dislocation. Entire families were uprooted, traditional community ties dissolved, and a new, brutal urban landscape emerged, ripe for social ills. It was progress, yes, but progress paved with the desperation of millions. And in the wake of this upheaval came an explosion of prostitution. This wasn't a moral failing. It was a direct, tragic consequence of economic hardship and severely limited options for women. For a young woman arriving in the city with no family, no skills, and facing starvation wages in a factory, sex work often became the only viable path to survival, or at least to something better than literal destitution. It was a grim calculus of necessity, where dignity was sacrificed for food, shelter, and the faintest hope of a better tomorrow. The Industrial Revolution created immense wealth, but it also created an immense underclass, and the brothel was their grim sanctuary. Gin palaces and brothels became inextricably intertwined, forming the grim nexus of working-class leisure and despair. You'd find them often in the same crowded, grimy streets, sometimes even in the same establishments. A man might drown his sorrows in cheap gin downstairs, then seek a different kind of solace upstairs. For the women, a gin palace might be a place to find clients, to seek a moment of warmth, or to dull the relentless pain of their existence. It was a self-perpetuating cycle of misery and fleeting escapism, a stark contrast to the burgeoning wealth of the industrial magnates. It was during this era that reformers, often driven by evangelical zeal, began to identify prostitution not just as an individual moral failing, but as a social evil, a symptom of deeper societal problems. They started to see the poverty, the lack of opportunities, the systemic exploitation, rather than simply blaming the fallen woman. While their solutions were often paternalistic and judgmental, it marked a significant shift in thinking. The brothel was no longer just a place of sin. It was a visible wound on the body of industrial society, demanding a more comprehensive, if often misguided, approach. Chapter 18: Victorian Veils, the Great Hypocrisy of 19th Century England. Ah, the Victorian era, the age of public prudishness, where piano legs were covered lest they incite improper thoughts, and a profound, almost pathological denial of sexual reality reigned supreme. On the surface, it was an era of strict moral codes, rigid social etiquette, and an almost obsessive commitment to decorum. You were meant to be utterly chaste, particularly if you were a woman, and even more particularly if you were a respectable one. Everything remotely suggestive was swept under the plush, heavy carpets of Victorian sensibilities. It was a spectacular performance of moral purity, enacted on a grand societal stage. But beneath that impeccably starched surface lay a thriving, sophisticated, and utterly pervasive underground of brothels, assignation houses, and discreet services, catering to the insatiable demands of Victorian gentlemen. While respectable wives were meant to be pure, demure, and largely passionless, their husbands found their needs met in a shadow economy that operated with remarkable efficiency. From opulent, high-class establishments to dingy backroom operations, London, and indeed every major Victorian city, pulsed with a hidden life of indulgence. It was the great hypocrisy, magnificently performed by an entire society, where everyone knew what was happening, but absolutely no one spoke of it in polite company. The fallen woman became a ubiquitous figure in Victorian literature and social commentary, a subject of both intense pity and fierce condemnation. She was simultaneously a victim of circumstance, forced into a life of sin by poverty and societal indifference, and a moral pariah, embodying the era's deepest fears about female sexuality and social disorder. She was a convenient scapegoat, a repository for all the anxieties about vice and urban decay, embodying the conflicting attitudes towards female sexuality that plagued the era. She was, in essence, the unavoidable byproduct of male desire and societal double standards. And then there were the gentlemen's clubs, those bastions of male exclusivity and apparent respectability. Not all brothels were explicit, with red lights blazing. Many of these clubs offered discreet services, veiled introductions, and a labyrinthine world of indulgence behind their respectable facades. A gentleman might join a club for its political discourse or its fine dining, but also for its quiet arrangements for companionship or its connections to the demi-monde. It was all about maintaining appearances, preserving one's reputation, and navigating the intricate social codes that allowed gentlemen to indulge their desires without publicly staining their honor. The Victorian veil was thick, but it was also remarkably porous for those who knew where to look. Chapter 19. Parisian Splendor. The Grandes Maisons and Their Gilded Cages. If Victorian England perfected the art of sexual hypocrisy, Belle Epoque Paris perfected the art of the luxurious brothel. This was the golden age of the Parisian bordello, where legendary establishments like Le Chabanais, 122, and La Fleur Blanche weren't just businesses, they were institutions, monuments to opulence and discretion, catering to a clientele that expected nothing less than sensory overload and absolute anonymity. Imagine a world where every desire, however niche or unusual, could be meticulously fulfilled within exquisitely designed walls. These weren't mere houses. They were pleasure palaces, theaters of the illicit, where reality itself seemed to bend to the whims of the wealthy. Luxury and discretion were the twin pillars upon which these grand maisons were built. Opulent interiors, rivaling the finest hotels and private residences, greeted clients. We're talking velvet, silk, gilt, marble, and chandeliers. A veritable feast for the eyes, designed to transport you to another reality. Secret passages and hidden doors allowed for discreet entrances and exits, protecting the reputations of the powerful. Themed rooms offered an array of fantasies, from the Moorish room at Le Chabanais to various exotic boudoirs designed to ignite specific desires. An elaborate system of service, with maids, valets, and discreet staff, ensured every whim was met with impeccable efficiency. It was a self-contained world, a universe unto itself, where the outside ceased to exist for a few glorious, expensive hours. And the clientele? A veritable who's who of European elites. Royalty, politicians, captains of industry, renowned artists, celebrated writers, they all flocked to these establishments, seeking anonymity and exotic pleasure. Think King Edward VII commissioning a special love throne for his visits to Le Chabanais, or discreet ministers conducting clandestine meetings over champagne and courtesans. These were places where social hierarchies briefly dissolved, replaced by a universal pursuit of pleasure, where the rich and powerful could shed their public personas and indulge their private selves, knowing that their secrets were safe within these gilded cages. Yet, beneath the glittering surface of luxury and discretion lay the registry system, a bureaucratic facade of control that rarely, if ever, truly protected the women. Officially regulated, with mandatory health checks, often invasive and humiliating, and police surveillance, the system was designed to control disease and maintain public order, but it also effectively criminalized and dehumanized the women, branding them as registered prostitutes, restricting their freedoms, and making it incredibly difficult to leave the profession. It was a grand illusion of management, creating a veneer of public health and order, while simultaneously entrenching exploitation and denying the women any real autonomy or dignity. The splendor was for the clients. The cage was for the women. Chapter 20. American Wild West, Frontier Brothels and Entrepreneurial Madams. Now, let's yank ourselves across the Atlantic and tumble into the dusty, chaotic landscape of the American Wild West. Here, the brothel wasn't just tolerated. It was often an absolutely essential social hub, sometimes one of the very first substantial buildings to rise in a new, raw settlement. Think of a fledgling mining town springing up overnight, populated almost entirely by lonely, hardened men. What do they need? Gold, whiskey, and, inevitably, companionship. The brothel often arrived right alongside the saloon and the general store, providing a vital, if morally ambiguous, service in these lawless, male-dominated lands. It was a foundational piece of frontier infrastructure. And in this rough-and-tumble world, a fascinating, often contradictory figure emerged, the madam as power broker. Figures like Josie Earp, Wyatt's wife, often debated, Nellie Bly, a different Nellie Bly, not the journalist, and the legendary Poker Alice Ivers became entrepreneurs, operating with a fierce independence in lands where official law was often scant and capricious. They were shrewd businesswomen, often wealthy, respected in a strange frontier way, and capable of wielding significant influence in their communities. They managed complex businesses, handled finances, dealt with difficult clients, and protected their girls, often with a shotgun if necessary. They were tough, intelligent, and carved out positions of power in a world that largely denied it to women. These frontier brothels were rarely just places for quick transactions. They were often full-fledged entertainment complexes, serving as the social heart of many settlements. They included saloons, gambling halls, dance halls, and, of course, the rooms upstairs. A man could ride into town, get a drink, play some cards, dance with a girl, and then retire for more intimate services, all under one roof. They were the original one-stop shops for frontier leisure, providing a full suite of diversions from the grinding hardship and loneliness of pioneering life. They were places of boisterous revelry, fleeting comfort, and often sudden violence. The women who worked in these establishments were often known as soiled doves, a rather delicate term for such a brutal existence. Their lives were undoubtedly difficult, fraught with danger, disease, and the constant threat of violence. Yet, in a bizarre twist of frontier economics, some of these women found a relative degree of economic independence and even social standing that might have been impossible elsewhere. They earned their own money, chose their clients, sometimes, and in a male-dominated world, carved out a space of agency, however circumscribed. It was a harsh independence, born of desperation, but independence nonetheless, in a time and place where few women had any at all. Chapter 21. The Architecture of Desire. Hidden Passages and Red Lights. Beyond the simple room with a bed, the brothel, over centuries, evolved a specialized architecture of desire. This wasn't just about utility. It was about discretion, efficiency, and, crucially, the creation of specific fantasies. From ancient Roman lupanaria to Parisian maisons de tolérance, these buildings were designed to facilitate a very particular kind of commerce, often with ingenious solutions for privacy, flow, and the subtle art of suggestion. It's a fascinating look at how human desires shaped physical spaces, often with surprising sophistication. Imagine the carefully planned layout of a functional brothel. You'd typically enter a parlor, often opulent, serving as a waiting room where clients could peruse the available women, perhaps over a drink. This was the showroom, the selection area. From there, clients would be escorted to private chambers, often small, self-contained rooms designed for intimacy and a quick turnaround. Some larger establishments even had complex systems of interconnecting rooms, hidden staircases, and discreet exits to ensure the utmost privacy for high-profile clients. Every element, from the lighting to the decor, was meticulously designed to create a specific atmosphere and facilitate the business at hand. And then, of course, there's the iconic, almost universally recognized, symbolic red light. Its origin stories are varied, often debated, but its enduring cultural impact is undeniable. Some say it came from sailors placing red lanterns in their windows to indicate a brothel. Others attribute it to the red warning lights used in early railway signaling, a subtle nod to a place of stopping and, well, signal crossing. Regardless of its precise genesis, the red light became, and remains, a universal signifier of illicit pleasure, instantly recognizable across cultures. It's a fascinating example of a simple visual cue becoming a shorthand for an entire underworld, a beacon for those seeking certain services. As technology advanced, so too did the brothel's operational efficiency. Call bells, often hidden or discreetly placed, allowed clients to summon services or drinks without shouting. Peepholes allowed madams or bouncers to monitor activity or vet clients discreetly. And then, of course, there were the more creative contraptions and devices designed to enhance the experience, or, more often, to facilitate control and surveillance. From early mechanical beds to more elaborate hidden mechanisms for observation, the brothel often became a testing ground for ingenuity, all in the service of pleasure, profit, and power. It's a dark testament to human inventiveness when applied to the most primal of industries. Chapter 22. Regulation's Heavy Hand, Contagious Diseases Acts, and Moral Panic. As the 19th century progressed, a creeping fear began to grip society, a fear far more tangible than mere moral decay, the fear of syphilis. This insidious venereal disease, with its horrifying long-term effects, became the driving force behind increasingly draconian attempts to control and medicalize prostitution. It wasn't just about sin anymore. It was about public health, military readiness, and the sanctity of the family unit. The fear of the pox infiltrating respectable society provided the perfect justification for an unparalleled level of state intervention into the lives of sex workers. Nowhere was this more evident than in Britain's infamous Contagious Diseases Acts, CDA, of the 1860s. These laws gave police powers to arrest any woman suspected of being a prostitute in designated garrison towns and force her into invasive medical examinations for venereal disease. If found infected, she could be detained in a lock hospital for months, often without trial. The critical detail? These laws were applied almost exclusively to women. The clients, the men who actually spread the disease, were rarely, if ever, subjected to such scrutiny. It was an appalling example of the unequal application of the law, targeting the vulnerable workers while allowing their male patrons to walk free, literally infected and unpunished. This blatant injustice ignited a fierce abolitionist campaign led by figures like Josephine Butler. This formidable Victorian activist, often derided and ostracized, fought tirelessly against these oppressive acts, arguing for women's dignity, freedom, and equal rights under the law. She exposed the brutality of the examinations, the degradation of the lock hospitals, and the fundamental injustice of a system that blamed and punished women for a problem created and perpetuated by men. Her campaign, a moral crusade against state-sanctioned exploitation, eventually led to the repeal of the CDAs, a rare victory for women's rights in a deeply patriarchal society. But the failure of regulation, even after the CDAs were repealed, was profound. These attempts to curb disease through coercive means largely failed to stem the tide of STIs. Instead, they served to criminalize, dehumanize, and further endanger women, driving the trade further underground and making it even more precarious. Regulation, designed for control, often amplified the very harms it purported to solve. It's a recurring theme in the history of sex work. Well-intentioned, or often ill-intentioned, efforts to manage the industry frequently end up harming the most vulnerable, while the underlying demand and profit motives persist, stubbornly unaddressed. Chapter 23: The Business of Bodies, Economics, Exploitation, and Entrapment. Let's talk brass tacks, or rather, dirty lucre. The Madam's Ledger, that grim document of human transactions, tells a stark tale of how profits were made, expenses deducted, and insidious debts accrued, often keeping women perpetually bound to their profession. A client would pay a fee, a percentage of which went to the madam, another chunk to house expenses, rent, food, laundry, protection, and often a ridiculously small fraction, if any, to the woman herself. It was a pyramid scheme of desperation, with the madam at the top, skimming off the cream of human vulnerability. This was the insidious system of debt bondage, the invisible chains that kept countless women trapped. They would arrive at a brothel, often with nothing, and immediately incur debts for their room, board, clothes, doctor's visits, even the very makeup on their faces. These debts were often inflated, impossible to pay off, and cleverly structured to ensure that a woman could never earn enough to escape. Every transaction chipped away at an insurmountable deficit, keeping her perpetually working, always owing, always under the thumb of the madam or her protector. It was a brutally effective form of economic slavery, legally dubious, but socially pervasive. Recruitment methods ranged from the tragically mundane to the horrifically violent. For many, it was pure, unadulterated economic necessity, a desperate choice between starvation or sex work. For others, particularly in the later 19th and early 20th centuries, it involved sophisticated networks of coercion and outright kidnapping, fueling the sensationalized white slavery panic. Young, vulnerable women, often from rural areas or immigrant communities, were lured with false promises of legitimate work, then trapped and forced into prostitution, their passports confiscated, their identities erased. It was a dark, transnational trade in human beings, driven by profit and predatory opportunism. Within the brothel, a brutal hierarchy of workers often existed, reflecting the harsh realities of their profession. At the top, a few rare courtesans might achieve a degree of autonomy, even wealth, negotiating their own terms and cultivating a select clientele. But far below them were the vast majority, the parlor girls, the dance hall girls, and at the absolute bottom, the streetwalkers, often the most exploited, the most desperate, and the most vulnerable. Each rung of this brutal social ladder represented a different degree of peril, a different level of control, and a different, often diminishing, share of the paltry profits. It was a bleak meritocracy of misery. Chapter 24. The Clients, a motley crew of desires. So, who frequented these dens of commercial intimacy? Was it just the depraved and the desperate? Not by a long shot. The client base was a truly motley crew, a cross-section of society revealing far more about collective human desire than any moral treatise ever could. From lonely sailors and migrant workers seeking fleeting warmth in a foreign port, to bored aristocrats and powerful politicians indulging their secret fantasies, the brothel welcomed them all. It was the great equalizer of lust, where social distinctions often dissolved at the door, replaced by a common, if unspoken, understanding. Motivations, too, were as varied as the clientele themselves. For some, it was purely sexual release, a biological imperative met with transactional efficiency. For many, it was the desperate need for companionship, a moment of human connection, however superficial, in a lonely world. For others, it was an escape from the suffocating pressures of societal expectations, a place where they could shed their respectable facades and be their true, often less virtuous selves. And for some, it was about fantasy fulfillment, the chance to explore desires deemed unacceptable in the outside world, or a fleeting moment of power over another human being. The brothel was a canvas for every shade of human longing. The respectable client, however, operated under a carefully constructed veil of deception, maintaining a double life with almost theatrical precision. By day, he was the upright businessman, the devoted husband, the pillar of the community. By night, he slipped into the shadows, his public face of virtue meticulously maintained while he indulged his private desires. The fear of exposure was constant, the need for discretion paramount. It was a societal game, where reputation was everything, and the brothel provided the necessary stage for this elaborate performance of hypocrisy, ensuring that appearances were maintained, even as morals were compromised. Indeed, brothels often served as a grim safety valve, a tacit social contract between men and society. The prevailing belief, often unstated, was that by channeling male sexual frustration away from respectable women, wives, daughters, virgins, brothels prevented worse societal ills like rape and adultery within the marital home. It was a cynical utilitarian argument, sacrificing one group of women for the perceived protection of another, revealing the deeply ingrained misogyny at the heart of many historical societies. The brothel, in this view, was not just a place of sin. It was a regrettable but necessary component for maintaining a fragile, patriarchal order. Chapter 25. The Workers' Lives, Dreams Deferred, Realities Endured. Behind the swinging doors and beneath the red lights, the lives of the women working in these brothels were a relentless cycle of dreams deferred and harsh realities endured. Their daily routines were a grueling grind, the endless waiting in parlors, presenting themselves to clients, the intimate transactions, the fleeting moments of respite snatched in crowded dormitories. It was a constant performance, a perpetual state of emotional labor, managing client expectations, suppressing personal feelings, and maintaining a facade of availability and desire, even when none existed. Every day was a fresh erosion of self. The psychological toll was immense, leaving deep and often irreparable scars. Trauma was a constant companion, whether from violence, coercion, or the sheer grinding dehumanization of constant objectification. Many women developed coping mechanisms like dissociation, mentally detaching themselves from their bodies during interactions, a desperate attempt to preserve some sliver of self. Others grew hard, cynical, developing a protective shell against the relentless assaults on their spirit. The emotional scars, though invisible, were as profound and debilitating as any physical injury, manifesting as anxiety, depression, and a profound sense of brokenness. Health hazards were an ever-present, terrifying reality. Sexually transmitted infections, particularly syphilis and gonorrhea, were rampant and, for much of history, untreatable, leading to agonizing illness and early death. Unwanted pregnancies were a constant threat, often ending in dangerous, back-alley abortions or the grim choice of abandonment. Violence, from drunken clients, abusive madams, or jealous rivals, was a daily possibility. Substance abuse, alcohol, laudanum, opium, became a common escape, a way to numb the physical and emotional pain, further trapping women in a cycle of dependency. Their life expectancy was tragically short, a brutal testament to the dangers of their profession. Yet, amidst this relentless exploitation, brief moments of community and solidarity could sometimes bloom. Sisterhood among workers, born of shared suffering, was not uncommon. They would protect each other from violent clients, share meager resources, and offer a sympathetic ear to stories of hardship and loss. These fleeting connections, these moments of mutual support and understanding, were often the only solace in an otherwise brutal existence. They were a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, finding light and connection even in the darkest corners of society, a small, fragile beacon in the face of relentless exploitation. Chapter 26. WW1's War on Vice, Soldiers, Sanitation, and State-Sanctioned Sex. When the Great War erupted, dragging millions of men into the muddy, bloody trenches of Europe, armies suddenly faced an immense logistical problem far beyond bullets and bread: morale and the ever-present sexual needs of vast numbers of stressed, traumatized, and lonely soldiers. Commanders quickly realized that rampant, unregulated sexual activity led to two major issues: venereal disease, which could decimate troop strength faster than enemy fire, and indiscipline, which could undermine the war effort. This led to a fascinating and deeply disturbing phenomenon: the state-sanctioned, or at least state-managed, brothel. Official military brothels, often established or tightly regulated by the state, became a grim reality behind the front lines. In France, for example, the maisons tolérées, tolerated houses, were created specifically for soldiers. These were places where health checks were mandatory for the women, prices were fixed, and soldiers were often granted passes to visit. The stated aim was clear: control disease, maintain order, and provide a controlled release for the troops, thereby reducing the chances of them committing sexual assaults against local women or deserting. It was a cold, pragmatic calculation of human management, treating sexual urges as another logistical challenge to be overcome. This era perfectly encapsulated the brutal double standard at play. The state was ostensibly protecting soldiers' health and morale, yet it did so by simultaneously condemning and exploiting the women who served them. These women were seen as a necessary resource, a means to an end, stripped of agency and dignity, subjected to invasive examinations and strict controls, all for the good of the fighting force. They were simultaneously essential and utterly disposable, fulfilling a need while being branded as pariahs, highlighting the profound hypocrisy that has always underpinned state involvement in sex work. The impact on local populations around these vast military encampments was predictably devastating. The sudden influx of millions of soldiers created an unprecedented demand for commercial intimacy, leading to a dramatic increase in prostitution, often drawing in desperate women from impoverished communities. This created new social problems, fueled exploitation, and left a long, painful legacy of trauma and shame in its wake. The war on the Western Front might have been fought over territory and ideology, but on a more intimate level, it was also a war on vice, fought by exploiting the most vulnerable. Chapter 27: Prohibition and Speakeasies, When Vice Went Underground Again. Fast forward to the 1920s in the United States, an era often romanticized as the Roaring Twenties, but which also brought with it a peculiar social experiment: alcohol prohibition. This, predictably, didn't stop people from drinking. It just drove it underground, creating a vast, lucrative black market. And when one vice is pushed into the shadows, others tend to follow, or at least find convenient new homes. Prohibition, it turned out, had a fascinating spillover effect on other illicit activities, inadvertently creating new opportunities for organized crime to expand its portfolio. This is where the speakeasy and the brothel often became deliciously intertwined. Many speakeasies, those secret bars where bathtub gin flowed freely, were often co-located with, or even disguised within brothels. You'd go for a drink, a dance, a bit of jazz, and then, if the mood struck and the prices were right, you could find other forms of companionship upstairs. They offered a full package of illicit delights, a one-stop shop for breaking the law and indulging in forbidden pleasures. It was a dangerous, thrilling, and profoundly alluring world, a magnet for those seeking escape from the stifling morality of the age. And who better to capitalize on this new criminal ecosystem than organized crime? Al Capone, Meyer Lansky, and their ilk didn't just control alcohol and gambling. They swiftly expanded their syndicates to include sex work. Brothels became another revenue stream, another territory to control, another part of the vast, interconnected network of illicit enterprise. This gave rise to more organized, more ruthless forms of exploitation, as women were often trafficked across state lines and brought under the iron fist of powerful crime bosses. The romanticized gangster era had a very dark, very real underbelly, funded by booze, bets, and bodies. Paradoxically, this era of prohibition and clandestine vice also lent a certain glamour to the illicit. Flappers, jazz, the thrill of the forbidden, it all blurred the lines between entertainment and vice, creating an intoxicating aura of rebellion and freedom. The speakeasy brothel became a symbol of a generation pushing against old boundaries, eager to shed the moral constraints of the past. It was a dangerous allure, one that romanticized the very real exploitation occurring within those smoky, secret rooms. The Roaring Twenties may have been a party, but for many, it was a party funded by desperation and managed by organized crime. Chapter 28. The Roaring Twenties and Beyond, Shifting Social Mores. The post-World War I era, particularly the Roaring Twenties, brought a whirlwind of social change, a profound sense of liberation after the trauma of global conflict. Women's suffrage movements gained ground, fashion radically changed, short skirts, bobbed hair, and social constraints began to loosen at an unprecedented pace. There was a palpable sense of new freedoms, a cultural earthquake that shook the foundations of traditional morality. Women had more economic opportunities, more agency, and a growing sense of self-determination, which inevitably had an impact on the traditional institutions of commercial intimacy. This era saw a slow but significant decline of the traditional, institutionalized maison de tolérance, the grand brothel. With women gaining more freedom and society becoming generally more permissive, the necessity for formal, regulated brothels began to diminish. Casual dating became more common, sexual attitudes loosened, and the rigid social segregation that had fueled the demand for institutionalized sex work started to erode. While brothels didn't vanish entirely, their prominence and social function began to wane, becoming less of a central social institution and more of a niche, often more clandestine, service. In its place, new, more individualized forms of sex work began to emerge. The call girl, discreetly operating from private apartments, became a popular choice for clients seeking discretion and a more personalized experience. Street work, always present, continued, but the institutionalized, almost industrial-scale brothel began to lose its dominance. It was a shift towards decentralization, a move from the grand, centralized temple of vice to a more distributed, less overt network of individual transactions. The sexual revolution, in its early stirrings, was quietly transforming the landscape of commercial intimacy. And then the Great Depression hit, pulling the rug out from under any illusions of newfound prosperity and freedom. The economic devastation of the 1930s drove even more women into sex work, often out of sheer desperation for basic necessities like food, shelter, or simply to support their families. The relative autonomy that some women had gained in the 20s evaporated under the crushing weight of unemployment and poverty. Brothels, however diminished, found a new, tragic supply of workers, fueled by an economic crisis that forced impossible choices upon an already vulnerable population. The pendulum of social progress swung back, violently, leaving many women with no option but to sell their bodies for survival. Chapter 29: World War II's Shadows, Occupied Territories, and Comfort Stations, Western Context. World War II, a conflict of unprecedented scale and brutality, cast incredibly long, dark shadows. And within those shadows, the grim reality of military brothels and coerced sex resurfaced with terrifying clarity. Across Europe, particularly in occupied territories, military brothels were often established, or at least tolerated, for German, Allied, and local forces. The logic, tragically, remained the same as in World War I: control venereal disease, maintain soldier morale, and prevent sexual assaults on the respectable local population. It was a brutal, pragmatic approach to managing the logistics of war at the expense of human dignity. And while the term comfort women is most often associated with the horrific systematic sexual slavery perpetrated by the Japanese Imperial Army in Asia, it's crucial to acknowledge the broader historical context of forced prostitution by various armies, including Western ones. While perhaps not always as overtly formalized or centrally organized as the Japanese system, the power dynamics of occupation and military presence frequently led to similar outcomes: the coercion and exploitation of local women for the sexual gratification of soldiers. The specific term might differ, but the underlying concept of military-controlled or condoned sexual slavery is a dark thread that runs through many military histories, regardless of geography. The post-war reckoning in Europe often involved frantic attempts to clean up cities and societies after liberation. This often meant a swift, often brutal crackdown on those perceived to be collaborators or moral degenerates. And predictably, the most vulnerable were often targeted: women who had been forced into prostitution during the occupation, or those who had simply engaged in relationships with soldiers from opposing sides. They were shaved, shamed, and often violently punished, while the soldiers who had exploited them, and the systems that had allowed it, largely escaped scrutiny. It was a perverse form of collective catharsis, punishing the weakest links in the chain of wartime suffering. The long-term trauma of women caught in conflict zones, forced into sexual slavery or prostitution, remains one of the most often overlooked and under-discussed aspects of wartime history. Their stories are rarely told, their suffering often dismissed or minimized, and their experiences relegated to the dusty footnotes of official histories. These women, whether officially comfort women or simply victims of wartime exploitation, bore the brunt of military conflict in a deeply personal and horrific way, their bodies becoming battlegrounds long after the official fighting had ceased. Chapter 30: Post-War Decline, Suburbia, Sexual Revolution, and New Forms. The 1950s dawned with a cultural shift towards the idealized nuclear family and the burgeoning phenomenon of suburbia. After the chaos of war, there was a collective yearning for order, stability, and a sanitized vision of domesticity. This new suburban ideal, with its manicured lawns and family-friendly values, paradoxically pushed overt vice further to the urban periphery or deeper underground. Traditional brothels, with their inherent connotations of sordidness and disorder, seemed increasingly out of step with the wholesome G.I. Joe and June Cleaver aesthetic of the post-war American dream. Then came the 1960s and the seismic shift of the sexual revolution. And here's the delicious irony. While sexual mores loosened dramatically and conversations about sex became more open, traditional brothels, paradoxically faced new competition. When free love became a rallying cry and casual sexual encounters gained a degree of social acceptance, the need for a formal, institutionalized, and often exploitative commercial setting for sex began to diminish. Why pay for it, some argued, when society was suddenly offering it for free, or at least with less stigma? It was an unexpected challenge to the oldest profession, coming from a place of liberation rather than condemnation. Coupled with these social shifts was the increasing autonomy of women. The post-war economic boom and expanding educational opportunities meant more women had access to legitimate, paying jobs. This, crucially, reduced the reliance on sex work as a primary means of survival. While poverty and desperation would always remain factors, the stark binary choice between destitution and prostitution began to soften for many. Women had more options, more pathways to economic independence, gradually eroding one of the fundamental drivers of the institutional brothel system. Consequently, the face of sex work itself began to change. Overt, institutionalized brothels became less common, replaced by more discreet and individualized forms. Escort services, often advertised through classifieds and later online, allowed for greater anonymity for both client and worker. Massage parlors, often thinly veiled fronts for sexual services, proliferated. The physical, brick-and-mortar brothel, as a central, identifiable institution, began its slow, inevitable decline, evolving into something far less overt, more decentralized, and more integrated into the broader fabric of modern urban life. The red light, it seemed, was beginning to flicker. Chapter 31: The Rise of Pornography and Changing Desires. As the latter half of the 20th century roared on, a new, technologically driven force emerged that would irrevocably alter the landscape of sexual desire and commercial intimacy: pornography. It started with the print revolution of adult magazines, bringing commercialized sexual imagery to the masses on an unprecedented scale. No longer did you need to visit a back alley bookstore. Now, magazines like Playboy and Penthouse could be found in drugstores, albeit discreetly wrapped. This was the first seismic shift, democratizing visual eroticism and making it readily, albeit quietly, accessible to millions. But the true game changer was the advent of film and video pornography. From grainy Super 8 loops to VHS tapes, then DVDs, and eventually the digital streaming era, pornography became a new, widely accessible, and increasingly diverse way to consume sexual fantasy. It moved from niche, underground markets to a mainstream cultural phenomenon, creating an entirely new industry built on the visual depiction of sex. It was a revolution, allowing individuals to explore desires, learn about different practices, and find gratification without any direct physical interaction. The impact of this on traditional brothels was predictably profound. The lingering question remains: did the ubiquity of pornography satisfy desires that were previously met by physical interaction in brothels, thereby reducing the need for actual sex workers? For some, it undoubtedly offered a private, low-risk, and convenient alternative, fulfilling fantasies without the social stigma, health risks, or financial cost of physical encounters. It allowed for consumption on demand, in the privacy of one's own home, fundamentally changing the economics and logistics of the sex industry. This was the ultimate commercialization of sex, moving it from a private, often whispered transaction to a mass media spectacle. It transformed sex from something largely experienced into something widely consumed. The brothel as a physical location still existed, but its role in the broader economy of desire was undeniably challenged. Pornography fundamentally altered how society engaged with and consumed sexual fantasy, pushing the boundaries of what was considered acceptable and irrevocably changing the nature of commercial intimacy in the Western world. Chapter 32: The Internet's Invisible Hand, From Red Lights to URLs. And then, as if the pornography revolution wasn't enough, along came the Internet, the ultimate decentralizer, the invisible hand that would completely redefine the brothel. The glowing red light, once a physical beacon of illicit pleasure, began its transformation into a digital one, the URL. The entire landscape of commercial intimacy, already shifting, was utterly transformed, exploding into a vast, anonymous, and globally connected marketplace that defied traditional boundaries and regulations. Online escort directories, websites, and eventually apps became the new frontier of sex work advertising. No longer did clients have to wander a red light district or rely on word of mouth. A few clicks could bring up a curated selection of providers, complete with photos, reviews, and service lists. This created vast, anonymous marketplaces, connecting clients and workers with unprecedented ease and efficiency. It democratized access, for better or worse, making the menu of commercial intimacy accessible from virtually anywhere with an internet connection. Then came the even more radical innovations: camming, OnlyFans, and other forms of virtual sex work. This was the ultimate decentralization of the brothel, moving from a physical space entirely to digital platforms. Workers could operate from their own homes, setting their own hours, controlling their own content, and interacting with clients from around the globe, all without ever being in the same room. It offered unprecedented autonomy for some, albeit within the confines of a still often stigmatized industry, and fundamentally altered the concept of being in a brothel. This global reach and anonymity, while offering some advantages, also created immense new challenges. For regulation and law enforcement, tracking and controlling this decentralized transnational industry became a nightmare. For anti-trafficking efforts, identifying and rescuing victims became exponentially harder, as traditional physical indicators of exploitation disappeared into the digital ether. The lingering question, then, is profound. Is the brothel truly gone, a relic of a pre-digital age? Or has it simply evolved, gone digital, spreading its tendrils into every corner of the internet, becoming something even more pervasive, less visible, and perhaps even harder to escape? Chapter 33: Modern Legalization Debates, Nevada, Germany, the Netherlands. In the modern era, amidst the digital sprawl and the echoes of historical debates, the question of legalizing prostitution, and by extension brothels, remains a contentious and complex one. We see various case studies around the world attempting to grapple with this necessary evil in different ways. Take Nevada, for instance, the only U.S. state where brothels are legal in certain rural counties, operating under a heavily regulated system, often reminiscent of the 19th century tolerated model, but with more stringent health and safety protocols. Then there's Germany and the Netherlands, both of which have famously embraced legal prostitution, including formalized brothel systems. In these countries, sex work is treated as a legitimate profession, with workers paying taxes, having access to health care, and operating under a legal framework. These are often held up as models by advocates for legalization, pointing to increased safety, better working conditions, and the potential for reduced organized crime and increased tax revenue. The arguments here are pragmatic. If it's going to happen anyway, why not make it safer and more regulated? The arguments for legalization are compelling, at least on paper. Proponents argue that it provides safety for workers by moving them out of the shadows, offers access to health services, generates tax revenue for the state, and, crucially, empowers workers by giving them legal rights and autonomy over their own bodies. Furthermore, a regulated system can potentially reduce the power of organized crime and make it easier to identify and combat human trafficking, as legitimate businesses are easier to monitor than clandestine operations. It's a vision of a controlled, professionalized industry. However, the arguments against legalization are equally passionate and deeply rooted. Opponents argue that legalizing prostitution, including brothels, normalizes and legitimizes the exploitation of women, inevitably leading to an increase in human trafficking as demand for sex workers grows. They contend that even in regulated systems, coercion and exploitation persist, and that the very act of commodifying human sexuality is inherently harmful. These arguments are often based on moral objections, but also on a belief that legalization simply expands the problem rather than solving it, creating a veneer of legitimacy over a fundamentally exploitative industry. An alternative approach, increasingly gaining traction, is the Nordic model, or equality model, adopted by countries like Sweden, Norway, and Iceland. This model decriminalizes the sex worker, recognizing them as victims while criminalizing the client and those who profit from the sex trade, pimps, brothel owners. The aim is to reduce demand for commercial sex, thereby ultimately dismantling the industry and reducing exploitation and trafficking, rather than attempting to regulate it. It's a radical departure, attempting to shift the burden of criminality from the exploited to the exploitor, and offering a different vision for managing the enduring reality of the sex trade. The debate rages on as societies continue to grapple with a problem as old as civilization itself. Chapter 34: The Enduring Stigma Beyond the Brothel Walls. Despite centuries of existence, societal necessity, and sometimes even official toleration, one thing remains stubbornly, tragically constant: the enduring stigma attached to sex work. Beyond the brothel walls, the social condemnation of those who sell sexual services remains fiercely potent, a brand of shame that sears deeply and permanently. You can legalize it, regulate it, or drive it underground, but you cannot, it seems, erase the societal judgment that follows those who engage in it. This is nowhere more evident than in the pervasive double standard that has plagued the sex industry since time immemorial. Clients, particularly the respectable ones, often escape judgment, their indiscretions neatly swept under the rug of male privilege and societal complicity. Their reputations remain largely intact, their careers largely unaffected. Meanwhile, sex workers, overwhelmingly women, bear the full brunt of societal shame, ostracization, and moral condemnation. They are branded, shamed, and often denied basic human dignity, while their patrons walk free, unblemished by the very transactions they participated in. It's a hypocritical imbalance that speaks volumes about power, gender, and societal values. For those who manage to leave the industry, reintegration into normal society presents immense, often insurmountable challenges. The stigma follows them like a shadow, making it incredibly difficult to secure housing, find employment, or simply forge new relationships. Past associations, even if years removed, can derail lives, perpetuating a cycle of marginalization and denying opportunities for a fresh start. Society, in its collective moralizing, often offers little in the way of true redemption or acceptance, choosing instead to eternally punish those who once stepped outside its narrow confines of acceptable behavior. This enduring stigma, however, has also galvanized activism and advocacy. Across the world, sex workers' rights movements fight for decriminalization, safety, and dignity, demanding recognition as legitimate workers and an end to discriminatory practices. Anti-trafficking efforts, too, work tirelessly to rescue and rehabilitate victims fighting against the forces of exploitation. And a broader, more nuanced conversation is slowly emerging, challenging the simplistic narratives of sin and victimhood, seeking to understand the complex realities of sex work and advocate for the safety, autonomy, and well-being of those involved. It's a continuous, often uphill fight for dignity and fundamental human rights. Chapter 35: The Ghosts in the Rooms, Legacy and Lore. As we approach the end of our grim tour, it's worth acknowledging that brothels, far from being just forgotten historical footnotes, continue to exert a powerful pull on our collective imagination, manifesting as ghosts in rooms and legends in lore. The enduring appeal of dark tourism, with visitors flocking to former red light districts or preserved historical brothels, speaks to a morbid fascination, a desire to peer into the lives that once pulsed within those walls. Ghost stories abound, often romanticizing the tragic figures of the past, transforming their suffering into tantalizing tales for tourists. Brothels, with their inherent drama, power dynamics, and human cost, have also become incredibly potent cultural symbols, shaping literary and cinematic portrayals for centuries. From tragic heroines forced into the life to ruthless madams wielding surprising power, these establishments offer fertile ground for storytelling. They represent forbidden desires, societal hypocrisy, and the enduring struggle of the marginalized, becoming powerful metaphors for broader societal issues. Think of the romanticized courtesans, the gritty realism of a bordello in a western, or the psychological complexity of a madam's inner world. These places continue to inspire, provoke, and haunt our cultural landscape. Indeed, some former brothels have even been preserved as museums and historical sites, offering glimpses into their controversial past. Places like the Pompeii Lupanar or the various preserved brothel museums in countries like Australia or the United States serve as tangible reminders of this often erased history. They provide an opportunity to confront the uncomfortable truths of the past, to understand the lives lived within those walls, and to reflect on the cultural impact of these institutions. They are not just buildings. They are silent witnesses to centuries of human desire, desperation, and the relentless march of time. Ultimately, the cultural impact of brothels is far-reaching and surprisingly profound. They have shaped art, literature, language, and our understanding of human desire, power, and societal hypocrisy. They reflect our deepest fears and our most primal urges, our capacity for both profound cruelty and fleeting connection. They stand as a testament to the enduring presence of commercial intimacy, a constant reminder that for all our progress, some aspects of the human condition remain stubbornly, messily, and tragically unchanged. The whispers of the past continue to echo in these rooms, long after the physical occupants have departed. Chapter 36. The curtain falls, for now, a farewell to formal follies. And so, my dear, long-suffering listener, we draw the curtain on this long, sordid, and hopefully exquisitely tedious journey through the history of Western brothels. We've traversed millennia, from the sacred harlots of ancient Mesopotamia to the digital dimensions of modern sex work, a relentless, repetitive testament to human nature's enduring complexities. If you've managed to stay awake through this marathon of historical depravity, you are a stronger, or perhaps simply more sleep-deprived individual than I gave you credit for. What have we learned from this exhaustively detailed excursion into humanity's underbelly? That the unchanging human elements, desire, desperation, exploitation, adaptation, are a cycle that seems utterly eternal. Societies change, technologies advance, moral frameworks shift and crumble, but the fundamental engines of commercial intimacy remain remarkably constant. The mechanisms may evolve, the locations may shift, the language may soften, but the underlying push and pull of supply and demand for sexual services, often fueled by profound inequality, endures. It's a depressing constant, isn't it? And that, my friends, is the truly boring truth. It's messy, human, endlessly repetitive, and a testament to our persistent flaws and our equally persistent capacity for adaptation. There are no neat resolutions, no grand moral victories, just the relentless, cyclical nature of human interaction, played out across centuries in countless hidden rooms and public squares. It's not a story with a heroic arc. It's a detailed, often uncomfortable, exploration of the enduring shadow cast by human desire and societal constraint. Now, wasn't that just the most exquisitely tedious tour through humanity's underbelly? A delightful plunge into the grim, the sordid, and the perpetually unsettling. Consider your mind thoroughly purged of any frivolous thoughts. Pleasant nightmares, my dear insomniacs. May your slumber be deep, undisturbed, and utterly free of historical venereal disease or Madam's ledgers. If you're somehow still conscious, congratulations, you've earned some actual sleep. Or, if you're a glutton for punishment and possess an unusually robust constitution for this kind of historical sludge, perhaps you might consider subscribing. Or don't. History, much like the tireless march of human folly, doesn't particularly care. It just is. Now, go. Rest. You've earned your oblivion.